As COP27 approaches its end, diplomats have not come to an agreement on climate disaster reparations for those most impacted by global warming.
Winter has begun in Ukraine with dropping temperatures, just as 10 million people are without electricity in the latest Russian bombardment.
8 years after Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 was shot down over Ukraine, a result for the families of the victims, as 3 men are sentenced to life in prison. Iran is gripped by more deadly violence as security forces continue to crack down on anti-government protests.
The family of a woman who died due to new restrictive abortion rules in Poland speak out at the European Parliament in Brussels.
With less than 24 hours to go until the end of COP27 in Egypt, diplomats say they are far from reaching the agreement on climate disaster reparations. Many in the global south have been calling for funding to offset the devastation caused by global warming.
To establish a loss and damage fund, we will consider. We are out of time and we're out of money and we're out of patience. We must establish at this COP27 a loss and damage finance facility. The establishment of a loss and damage fund will determine the success or failure of our collective leadership here.
Welcomed with a round of applause by Brazilian climate activists, their country's president-elect has called for a restructuring of the UN, arguing that it is biased.
The UN needs to change. The UN cannot just stay on the side of the countries that won World War II. We need to have African countries in the Security Council, South American countries, Asian countries.
Richer nations had previously agreed to give 100 billion euros a year to the global south, a commitment they never kept. And the EU has now proposed a much smaller 1 billion euros for African nations.
The most vulnerable countries urgently need this money, and if we get bogged down in endless discussions about the form in which this should take, that, I believe, would not be doing them a favor.
Timmermans added that the fund could take several years before it could become effective, but solutions need to be faster, even if they fall short of the demands by climate activists.
Around 10 million people in Ukraine are without electricity, just as winter sets in. The fresh wave of intense Russian bombardments have targeted crucial power supplies and residential areas. It's reported that at least 7 people were killed. The consequences of another missile attack against Ukraine continues all day. Again, there have been emergency power outages in addition to planned ones. As of now, more than 10 million Ukrainians are without electricity. With dropping temperatures and snow falling in Kyiv, residents are now living without heating. However, some in the capital continue to be defiant despite the challenging situation. I know that the power of belief in us is so strong that we will survive it. We will overcome it. We can feel it. It's foolish to deny that we can't feel it, and it's foolish to deny threats that the colder it will get, the greater the risks that the winter in Kyiv will be. To put it mildly, it's difficult, but there's no doubt we will overcome it. The Kremlin blames the suffering of civilians on Kyiv's refusal to negotiate. Over in Kherson, residents are slowly adjusting to their new lives without the Russian military. We managed to carry on for many months, almost 9 months. I think we will live through the winter. The main thing is to get the electricity back. Meanwhile, the International Atomic Energy Agency has passed a third resolution, calling on the Kremlin to immediately cease all actions at the Ukrainian nuclear facilities. Strikes have fallen close to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant several times since February, with Russia and Ukraine blaming each other.
8 years after Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 was blown out of the sky over Ukraine, a result for the families of the victims. A Dutch court convicted 3 men for the downing of the aircraft, which killed all 298 passengers and crew. 2 Russians and 1 Ukrainian were sentenced to life in prison. A 3rd Russian national was acquitted of the charges. Those found guilty were judged to have played a key role in shooting down the jet, which was mistaken for a military aircraft. Moscow, which has refused to hand over the defendants, has vowed to study the sentence.
At the moment, I can say that we will examine this decision, because every nuance matters in these issues. After studying the legal document, we will then be ready to comment on it.
The Malaysia Airlines Boeing 777 was flying from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur when it was shot out of the sky amid a conflict between pro-Russia rebels and Ukrainian forces. Most of the victims were Dutch, Malaysian and Australian nationals. After years of investigation, the court concluded that their actions were coordinated with Moscow and that Russia provided support to the rebels in eastern Ukraine. A spiral of violence is gripping Iran. It's been 2 months since the death of Mahsa Amini sparked widespread unrest in the country. The young Kurdish woman was arrested by law enforcement officers for allegedly breaking hijab rules. Around a dozen protesters and security forces have reportedly been killed since Wednesday as the state looks to clamp down on anti-government demonstrations. On Thursday, at least 3 demonstrators and 2 paramilitaries were killed in separate clashes, one of which broke out during a ceremony to remember 4 young people killed by security forces. Human rights groups estimate at least 342 protesters have been killed in just 2 months. Thousands have been injured and more than 2,000 arrested, some of whom have been sentenced to death.
At least 21 people have been killed and several more injured after a fire broke out in a residential building in the Gaza Strip. Local sources say flames erupted at the Jabalia refugee camp after a gas leak during a birthday celebration. Gaza's Interior Ministry says an initial investigation revealed large amounts of gasoline stored at the site, fueling the blaze that quickly engulfed the building. The Palestinian National Authority has declared a day of mourning in honour of the victims.
Izabela Sabor from Poland, a 30-year-old woman, died last year of septic shock while 22 weeks pregnant. Thousands took to the streets in protest for a victim of the near ban on abortion approved in October 2020. Isabela's sister-in-law and the family's lawyer shared her last words with the European Parliament on Wednesday. She said in phone messages that doctors waited for the fetus's heart to stop before treating her infection symptoms.
Isabella wrote to her family during her hospitalization that she feels like an incubator, and I think, and I'm sure that she meant that nobody cares about her life, and the most important thing for everyone, including doctors in the hospital, is the firstly life of fetus, and secondly the legal situation of the doctors.
It still remains possible to make a legal abortion in the case of a threat to the mother's health and life, and in the case of rape or incest. But fetal abnormalities are no longer a reason to do so since the law changed, because the Constitutional Court considered it a eugenic practice. The chair of the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality in the European Parliament is suggesting a new legislative tool after coming back from a recent fact-finding mission in his native Poland.
The backlash in Poland, in Hungary and some other countries in the European Union show clearly that human rights are not for granted. That's why we need to create a catalogue, a systematic approach towards human rights, including women's rights in Europe. So the European Charter on women's rights would be ideal tool, including, for example, sexual and reproductive health rights.
Before the new law in Poland, there is an average of 1,000 legal abortions per year. Now it's down to 100 in a country of almost 40 million people. Women's rights activists say the real number is around 150,000, done with irregular access to abortion pills in undercover clinics or abroad.